I forbindelse med at vi har publisert et nytt intervju på vår Patreon-kanal i dag. I dag det tidligere Facebook-topp og VC-stjerne som heter Sam Lessin. De fleste har ikke hørt om han, men du burde ha hørt om han. Han var veldig viktig i utviklingen i Facebook i flere forskjellige måter, og senere blitt en veldig vellykket tidligfase-investor. Han har en vanvittig energi, vanvittig mange interessante ideer og mange interessante betraktninger, og veldig kjapp i hodet og kjapp i replikken. Absolutt verdt å høre på mye og lære av han. Hvis du vil følge med på hva som kommer på vår Patreon-kanal, så kan du også nå legge det inn på Spotify. Det går du bare å søke opp Tid penger på Spotify. Nå finner du 2 kanaler. Der du ser logoen vår, det står også Patreon. Kan du gå inn der, logge inn på din Patreon-bruker, og da har du tilgang direkte i Spotify. Da trenger du ikke å bruke noen eksterne apper. Mange bruker Spotify. Så tiderpenger.no/Patreon hvis du ikke medlem. Men nå går vi inn til Jason Cohen. Han har lykkes mange ganger. Da har vi hatt en seriegründer på, som har blitt intervjuet, som du nettopp har hørt, som jeg har gjennomført intervjuet med Jason Cohen. Han grunnla siste selskapet han grunnla heter VP Engine, og han har vært aktiv i mange ledd av oppstartsmiljøet. Jeg oppdaget han på grunn av et gammelt foredrag som gikk jorda rundt, der han snakket om forskjellen mellom å starte med investor kontra og såkalt bootstrap og finansiere seg selv. Jeg synes det var så interessant, så jeg snakket med han, og han stilte opp i intervjuet. Jeg må si det var inspirerende å høre på. Jeg drømmer meg litt bort når jeg hørte på han. Hva du synes om intervjuet og Jason Cohen?
Ja, drømme seg bort, det var jo egentlig, det var rart du skulle bruke det uttrykket, fordi jeg synes jo han var nesten hypnotisk, og, altså på en god måte, ikke misforstå, å høre på. Han veldig veltalende, og han kunnskapsrik, og jeg deler en del erfaringer som han også beskriver. Så fra altså det inspirerende og opplysende å høre på han, synes jeg. Og der hvor jeg deler hans erfaring, det var når han snakket om det der å starte et bedrift og være i bedrift, men så skjer det, altså bedriften utvikler seg, og så plutselig så liker du ikke bedriften du i lenger.
Din egen bedrift?
Ja, din egen. Altså jeg opplevde jo det samme på grunn av noe salg av noen selskaper, så fikk vi inn aksjonærer som da ikke ser på verden på samme måte som du gjør, som ikke har de samme verdigrunnlaget, da. Så at the end of the day så det jo egentlig det som en selv har. Og så oppdager man at man egentlig mistrives i egen bedrift. Jeg følte meg veldig kjente meg veldig igjen i det han sa om det. Men jeg synes jo tvers igjennom at det der var veldig opplysende og bra. Og jeg lurte jo på hvordan du hadde kommet på ham, men nå har du jo for så vidt forklart det gjennom at du hadde sett den videoen.
Jeg cold-calla han.
Ja, men det jo kjempebra, fordi jeg har ikke sett den videoen, men jeg synes det var utrolig interessant å lytte til ham, og jeg lyttet gjennom hele intervjuet, og jeg har senere gått tilbake og hørt deler av det, så jeg synes det vel verdt å høre, for å si det på den måten.
Litt sånn Silicon Valley så full av bullshitter, altså. Jeg helt immun mot budskapene deres. Alltid sånne forenklet budskap, og gjerne med en sånn enkel tagline, og du har et eller annet sånn begrep du måtte henge deg veldig opp i, sånn som lean og sånne type ting. Og jeg føler at han skjærer gjennom all bullshitten som han vant til å få fra de her folkene.
Ja, men jeg tror det mer representerer vekst. Altså når du får en sånn vekstselskap-boom, så tror jeg det der nesten generisk. Jeg opplevde det akkurat det samme.
Fra bullshitten?
Ja. Og den liksom buzzword-type ting. Du hører det samme, og som jeg har sagt til flere, og jeg har ikke møte med mange, fordi altså, jeg vet ikke hva det ligger på nå i uken, men nå kanskje 5-7 som tar kontakt i hver uke. Så handler jo det der, altså Altså de jeg har møte med, så er det ofte den responsen jeg gir. Altså det er å fokusere på det som du mener er unikt med din, altså buzzwordene. Når du kommer til seasoned investors, altså erfarne investorer, så har de hørt dem før, og de har hørt dem til gangs. Så forsøk å ikke bruke dem. Altså prøv heller å uttrykke ting, det du virkelig mener er unikt med din bedrift, på godt norsk, da.
Men er ikke, når man snakker i salgssammenhenger, er ikke ærlighet noe som du rart nok kommer lengst med? Det er i hvert fall noe jeg har erfart da. Å bruke sine egne svakheter som styrker.
Det er også avhengig av hvilken tid vi er inne i, for å være ærlig, fordi jeg...
Kanskje ikke så bra i boomtid, å være ærlig.
Nei, fordi du kan si at jeg opplever jo at i en fase, så er det den som overdriver mest, som får på en måte tilslaget. Mens den personen i en annen fase blir skrellet vekk på en måte ved første seleksjon. Så det kommer an på hvor vi er hen, altså i fasen, men det viktige er på en måte at du leverer og viser progresjonen din og så videre. Og særlig progresjon er at progresjonen din er at man kan demonstrere en solid progresjon i det man gjør. Slik at, for det styrker troverdigheten til at dette skal være gjennomførbart.
Skal vi bare gå i gang med intervjuet?
Ja, jeg anbefaler folk å høre på dette intervjuet. Altså for så vidt det gjør jeg med alle intervjuene våre, for vi gjør jo seleksjonen i utgangspunktet, og hadde vi ikke ment at det var interessant, så hadde vi ikke hatt det der, så ja, la oss gå i gang.
I guess the brief version is I've done 4 startups in the last 23 years. The latest one is WP Engine, which is the last 13 years, so quite a long time. And we're at about 1,200 employees globally, 200,000 customers. And before that, a startup called Smart Bear, which is where I get my online name, which is a Smart Bear, right? So that came from the previous startup. So those are the two sort of salient things, I guess.
And the speech I saw that you gave, which was very interesting, was I don't know where it was linked. It was linked on Twitter, I think, or maybe on Reddit. But regardless, it was a talk where you talked about the benefits of bootstrapping, self-financing your startup, or having an automatic, like having which in regular finance, I guess you refer to it as quality, where you have so much income that you're self-funding.
Right. That was from MicroConf, was the name of the conference, MicroConf, and that was 10 years ago, which I know because people were sort of celebrating the 10-year anniversary of that thing, which is still the most popular video from MicroConf on their YouTube channel. So I think people in general do enjoy that. It was, as you say, it was sort of an action-packed talk. So rather than having, let's say, a narrative arc and stuff like that, instead, it was just machine gunning lots and lots of things, that practical things that you could try to use for self-funding a company. Everything, right? Pricing and market and who's your customer and what type of product and all that.
But there's a major difference between 10 years ago and now. Is that realistically it's not so easy to find an investor right now for a startup?
It's never been easy. The vast majority of companies are not funded. So, I don't think it's ever been, there's times where it's slightly easier than other times, but it's never been easy, and it's never been the normal way to build a company. So, in that sense, it's still the right way for most people to build a company anyway.
What was your first, let's go back to the beginning. What was your first meeting with running your own business? What was your first inroads into it?
Well, even during college, I was working, and then right out of college, I started a strange kind of company that ended up being a consulting company. And then the bubble burst in 2000, and everything was weird. So it was supposed to be a product turned into a service company. And anyway, it was a strange experience that I wouldn't say was particularly successful.
And this was what time? What year?
Like like 1999 through 2001.
Okay. Were you caught up in the whirlwinds of that era?
Sort of. I mean, we were there, but we weren't one of these companies that had $60 million in funding and didn't do anything.
It's so interesting because I've been trying to figure this out. I remember hearing a talk years ago where someone referred to the moment when VC as a concept kind of changed, and that was the IPO of Netscape. And they talked about, I've not been able to get back to this, so this is only by memory. And they talked about that Netscape had a fundamentally different view of running a business than what was common in previous startups, which is making money. And they sort of laid the groundwork for what we now consider a startup, whereas you talk about things like burn rate, you try to scale as much as physically possible, as fast as possible, which is has been the trend for, well, since the 90s, really. But it kind of feels like that's changing now when the reality is changing. Do you remember this? And do you think that there has been a change of how VCs operate?
Certainly things have evolved, but I wouldn't say it's just changed, because everything you're saying people said in 2008, and everything you said people said in 2001. So I do think people value different metrics over time, but I don't think it's like there's this big change and it'll never change again. In fact, it goes through these cycles. And every time we have a down cycle, people value things like rule of 40, where it's growth balanced by having profits. Then when times are really good, it goes back to mostly caring about growth. And we've seen those several times since then. So I feel like unless something new changes in the world, I think that cycle will probably continue.
You've self-funded and you've had VCs. How has that been a different experience on the different sort of structures?
Well, they're very different in that the goals are very different. So when you're self-funding, your goal is not to be the biggest ever. Your goal is not to be a billion-dollar company. Your goal is not to go public. Now, some people say, oh, your goal is just to have a certain lifestyle. Sometimes that's true, and sometimes that's not true. And I think certainly there's a Silicon Valley attitude that looks down upon self-funded businesses and sees them all as, oh, you just want to be like a restaurateur and have your little restaurant and have your little lifestyle. Well, number one, some people do want that. And what exactly is the problem with that? I would think the world would be a wonderful place if there was a million of those, number one. Number two, a lot of people don't want to just do that. It's just, are you saying there's no space in between a true lifestyle business where you want to work fewer hours and make good money and enjoy life? There's no distance between that and wanting to become Facebook. There's no other path that makes any sense that people might want to do. That's ridiculous to me. It's just completely ridiculous. Now, I do think it's not true that every single path in the whole world makes sense either, because some paths are maybe self-inconsistent. So, for example, saying, oh yeah, I totally want to be a $1 billion company one day, but I don't want to grow fast. Well, that's just inconsistent, because to get to $1 billion, if you grow slowly, it takes too long. It might take 20, 30 years, even theoretically. And that's not how tech companies work. They don't just grow steadily for 20 years. So that just doesn't make sense. But but that's only because again, the math doesn't work and the structures don't work. But to say there's nothing in between a lifestyle and business and Facebook is ludicrous.
What is the most comfortable position? I've always wondered this, because I've been in kind of in both situations, and often you think getting funded is this amazing moment, but in reality, you're increasing the pressure, it feels like. And I've heard many people say similar things. How was it for you in the different structures, self-finance, where you have all the power, but you also don't, you have a huge pressure to deliver? How is that dynamic different?
I'm not aware of a situation where you're not under pressure. It's because if you're self-funded, you're under pressure because you have customers and you have employees and you have yourself and your own finances. And if you raise money, you have everything I just said plus investors too. So I don't know that there's a case where there's no pressure. I suppose you can get to a place, again, if it is a lifestyle type of business, you could get to a place where the business is making enough money, however you've defined that, and you're putting in however much work you want, and maybe you can get to that place. I'll note that most companies cannot get to that place because either it takes a whole lot more energy than that to make the value, or you just don't feel like relaxing. Just for the same reason that you wanted to not relax the first time, you want to not relax later too. So it can happen, of course, but it's not normal. So I don't think there's much of a scenario. And people think that a lot. They're like, well, if I could just hire one person, my life would be easier. If I could hire a manager, it'd be easier. If I could, once I get to 5 million in revenue, it'll be easier. If I raise money, we'll have money in the bank, and that will be easier. None of those things are true. I don't know of any events that make it easier other than you leaving. So people definitely think that, and me too. I'm certainly guilty of that thinking in the past, but now I know
But
that's
in the
wrong.
speech you did, I seem to recall you said that you wake up in the middle of the night, like in year 6 or something in the business, like how am I going to make payroll this month?
Sure.
Like a typical. Was that from your speech? Am I remembering correctly?
Yeah.
And that was kind of a eye-opening thing for me. And I know many people who have very, very successful businesses, and the scale doesn't necessarily seem like the greatest life. It seems like the pressure is almost crushing. Like you said, you don't never have pressure, but you do have significant less if it's eternal, because you don't have to deliver quarterly, you don't have to deliver payroll, for instance, necessarily.
If you're not delivering payroll, then you're probably not making that much money, and you may be under quite a lot of pressure. Now, another thing is, when I was talking about that was a company that did not have recurring revenue. That was one-time revenue. So every month, you're kind of starting from scratch. And that was bootstrapped. There was no investor telling me what I should do. But you're constantly worrying about it. So that's one nice thing about recurring revenue businesses, is that they're more predictable. If they're more predictable, you might relax a little bit, but not much, because we all know how it happens with businesses and technology and time, which is that you never know when the next competitor will happen. It's not just everything's good all the time. If you have no employees at all, it can be very hard to have kind of the right amount of work. In other words, if you want to never have an employee, you have to build a very special business. You have to really be careful about what kinds of things you do or don't do. Do you do support or not? What kinds of features do you do? What kinds of customers are you targeting? And so, again, you can construct that so that works, and I think that's awesome. I think one should do that, but I think sometimes people aren't thoughtful enough about that. They just sort of build businesses like what they think businesses ought to look like, or they just don't really think of it much at all and just go. And they figured, well, I'll figure it out as I go. But they end up building a business that's not a place that they want to be. For like maybe they don't want employees, but they built a business that has 8 employees. Or they would have been happier to not scale, but here they are at scale. And as you say, that can really be hard and something people don't like. But it can be just the opposite too. There's people that are only happy if they build something big. They see that as important and meaningful and impactful, and they're not necessarily wrong that that's meaningful and impactful for many employees, many customers, for themselves. That's not necessarily wrong either. And so if they don't have that big scale, they don't feel like there's a success. So it just goes to show that these things like success or happiness are not universal facts. They're things that are very personal. And sometimes as a person, you don't know who you are until you're in it, which is unfortunate, because maybe, again, you've built a business, or you're in a business that you don't like, and you didn't even know that that was going to happen. That happens all the time.
It's very interesting. Looking at your CV, I can see that you're not CEO of your own company.
Right.
Is that correct? Is that kind of a, I mean, of course it's done on purpose, but is that kind of a way to get around, to have a higher quality of life, having maybe not necessarily to deal with employee questions, like human resources type questions, or typical, like, there's a lot of, I don't want to use the word dirty work, but there's a lot of hard work, like emotional work or others, for a CEO. It's a difficult job, but to be a chief innovation officer would probably clear your schedule up a little bit.
Yep, that's the whole idea. So I have a framework about thinking about what I call fulfillment, because I think happiness is too strange a word. Some people maybe are never happy, and maybe that's okay. So I kind of prefer the word fulfilled. And the way I think of it is, there's things, and there's a lot of frameworks out there for this, and maybe they're all fine, really. But so the one I like is, there's things you love and things you're good at and things the company needs done. And by that I mean they need it. It needs it done well. Like, it's important that it be done well. And the more you can stay at the intersection of those three things, then that's fulfilling. And if you have only two, sometimes you'll have one or zero, but if you have just two, it can feel like things are good, but they're not good. And this is why I call these the traps. And this is why the three are important. So for example, if you're doing something you love and you're good at, that feels really good. You call that flow, right? You do it all day, you love it. At the end of the day, you have more energy than you started with. Wonderful. And as a founder, who's going to tell you not to do that? But if you're missing the piece that the company really needs it done, then the company's starved for something. And so the classic example is, you're an engineer, an engineering founder, so you spend all day making features because it's fun, and you don't spend all day working on marketing and sales and growing the business, which is what the business probably needs. And so the business never really gets off the ground because you're busy adding features thinking that's going to grow it, which it rarely does. And it's classic. It happens all the time. So it's a classic trap of, you're stuck in flow, but the business didn't need it. So another trap.
That's an interesting point there.
Yeah.
I've never heard that made. That's a very good point.
And who's going to tell you not to? You're the founder. So that's another reason why it's a trap, right? Maybe no one's even at the company, but even if they are, it's hard to tell you what to do. So another trap is, you love it and the company needs it done, but you're not good at it. And so a good example of that would be, or a classic example that happens all the time. Again, I did this too. Like, I fell in all these traps. I'm using myself as an example, right? I just also know, I also see it in other people. So an example of, you love it, the company needs it done, but you're not good at it, is something like, you say, okay, we have to do marketing, but I don't know anything about marketing, Google ads, let's say, just to take a simple example. So if I'm going to hire someone, whether it's a consultant or not, to do something like Google ads, I better figure it out for myself first, so that I know how to interview them and I know how to manage them. So I'm going to go figure out AdWords. And so you go figure out AdWords for 3 months. And at the end of that, you think you figured out AdWords and you're ready to go. But what's actually happened is, you're just really bad at AdWords still, because this is not what you're good at. Remember, it's what you love and what the company needs, but not what you're good at. You're not great at AdWords. You don't really know that much. You think you do because you're a founder and you think you're good at everything, especially if you spend 3 months on it. You must be a master now. But of course, you're not. And so you still don't know how to hire and manage that person, but you think you do. Or maybe you've decided AdWords doesn't work because you didn't figure it out in 3 months. But you're an idiot about AdWords. So why does that mean anything? So you see what I mean, how that's another trap where, if the company really needs it done, then being bad at it is not acceptable. And that's another trap that founders get into. And it's not actually fulfilling, doesn't actually help the company. And then the final trap is, you're good at it and the company needs it done, but you don't love it. And this is burnout. So this is where, just as you just said, like, it's very obvious from what you said that you don't like dealing with people and employees. And that's normal too. That's very normal. You want to write code or you want to make sales and you don't want to deal with people stuff. I got it. That's very common. But of course the company needs it done. And and maybe you're even good at it, whatever that skill is. And so you do it because someone needs to do it. And you're right, someone does need to do it. It's important, but you don't like it. You could do that for a little while, but if you do that for years and years, then you just resent work because you're doing things that you know need to be done. Someone's got to do it. You're good at it. You hate it. That's burnout.
That's a really interesting definition of burnout. And I think you're spot on.
Yeah. So if you don't like people management and you do it anyway, because of course it needs to be done, and as the founder, you have as a founder CEO does have a special kind of authority, and so you can be effective in a way that maybe no one else can, or it would take a very special CEO to have. At WP Engine, we have that very special CEO. We have that kind of a person, so it works. But it's true that that's unusual. So you stay there as the founder CEO, doing stuff like managing people or managing the executive team or raising money, perhaps, or managing the board if you have one, perhaps. Anyway, doing things that you don't like, but certainly need to be done and certainly need to be done well. There's no doubt about that. And so you're now in a position where you're doing work that you hate, which is horrible, and also talk about contrary to the whole point of entrepreneurship, to have some kind of life that you want, whatever that means. And here you are hating going to work. What? That's got to be exactly the opposite of the point of being an entrepreneur, is hating to go to work, right? So that's another trap. So you see what I mean by if you have two of the three, it can seem okay, or at least it can seem like you're on the right track, and you are partially on the right track. But it actually is pretty bad to miss the third one. Now, obviously, saying, all right, I'll be in all three all the time in the center is ideal. It's not physically possible to always be there, of course. But what I do think is very practical is you can ask just roughly what percentage of my time is in the middle. Is it like 1%, 10%, 50%, or 90%? Those are my only choices. Then you can probably say pretty quickly what it is, with only that level of precision. And if the answer isn't 50% or better, then that might be something you can construct an answer to. So there's many, many, many ways to construct answers. So it's very context dependent. But for example, there may be certain gaps you can hire for that would change that equation. Or you can do like me and not be the CEO anymore and realize that a different role would put me more in the center there, where it's still stuff I love, still stuff I'm good at, still stuff the company needs, but less of the stuff that's outside of that. And that was right for me. Also, you could change what the business is. And what I mean by that is, let's suppose you hate people management, but you want to be the CEO. Very reasonable. Okay, then you need to build a company that's profitable, that takes only one person to run it. And that just requires thinking about what that means about product, about customer service, about sales, about what's self-serve for customers versus what you do for them, versus what you are willing to hire for in contracting or not, what features you might do, how you would position against the competition. Like you would take that, all those questions or effective, implied questions I just asked, you'd ask, okay, if it's very important to solve for having a business that I want to run, what are all those trade-offs and all those other areas I need to make so that makes sense? Now that I think is a wonderful question, because that helps you get to that center, and you might need to change things or make hard decisions to keep in that more in that center. So that's how I would use that in practice to try to form how do I stay there? And again, there's so many answers, right? But those are the questions that lead you there.
Have you sold the company ever?
2. And we've also bought, at WP Engine, we've bought something like 5 or 6. I've also been investors in companies, and also some of them have been bought or sold. So yes, quite a bit. So
is it a good thing? I always wondered.
Is it good?
Because,
is that the question?
Yeah, because many people that I know that have started companies that are profitable and then sell it feel an emptiness in the sale, because work is such a huge part of your life. And if you sell it and leave it, or if you sell it and somebody else is the boss, is kind of the same thing, but you lose part of yourself, and the money isn't, like, over a certain point, isn't really that important. It doesn't really change much.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's what happens most of the time. There's even been some studies, not a lot, but there's some. And in the ones that I'm aware of, the majority of the people feel the way you said. The majority. So it's not only possible, it's the usual case that happens. One way to see why that would be the case is the following. There were an MRI study, so they're scanning your brain, and they showed the people pictures that are neutral, like landscapes. So you see the brain in sort of a resting state. Then they showed pictures of their kids. So the brain gets into this state of like, oh, my kids, like whatever that is, love and attachment and identity and, stuff, whatever the stuff is. Then they show pictures of landscapes again, and the brain goes back to the resting state. And then they show pictures of their logo of the company that they founded. And the brain goes back into the same state as the children. So when people say the business is like your child, it is literally like your child in terms of your brain state. So the idea that you would sell it and no longer be a part of it is like that, really. Not metaphorically, but physically, it really is like that in the brain. Another interesting thing, when you see some of these, again, the studies aren't that good, so I admit that, but for whatever we have, the symptoms are very much like postpartum depression. So same thing as where many mothers after having their kid are depressed and they don't know why. And the worst case, they feel like you must be a bad mother because you feel sad having a kid. Of course, that's not what's really going on. It's a chemical thing in the brain that you have little control over. And it's not because you're a bad mother, certainly. And now we know that, now meaning like in this decade as opposed to 50 years ago, right? We now know that. Anyway, the symptoms are similar. So once again, it's like this concept of it being that much part of who you are and that important in your life. And so selling it, it is your identity. As you say, the work is your identity. It is giving you purpose. It's also who you are. Like if someone asks, who are you? You say, I'm the founder of X. You wouldn't say, I'm the husband of somebody, or I'm the wife of somebody, or, you say, I'm the founder of X. That's what you answer when someone asks, who are you? And so when you ask who am I at the top of the call, that's what I said. So it is our identity. It's even in our words where we say it's our identity. So everything you said is right. And I'm just reinforcing what you're saying with the little information or data we have. It may be anecdotal still, but it's still all aligned in the same place. So I feel like that's pretty strong evidence, let's say, that that's how it is. But here's the thing. That doesn't mean selling was wrong. And this is the part that's really a catch-22. In other words, this is the part that's really actually kind of devastating, kind of terrible, which is that does not mean it was better to stay. Because another thing that's really common is that people hate the companies that they build. They resent it. They're burnt out and they don't want to be there. And they're very deeply unhappy at their own company, which already is unhappy, but then there's that meta level of unhappiness that it feels bad that you're unhappy about it, right? Both. And selling is a way to stop that, reset the clock, turn the page into a new chapter of life, and do something else. And just because turning that page is painful, which you're saying it is, and I agree with you, that doesn't mean the previous chapter was okay and you should have prolonged it. So just like a bad relationship, it hurts to break off a bad relationship. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have broken off the bad relationship. Just because it hurts to change. So you really have to evaluate, well, was it healthy and happy and fulfilling and purposeful and good before the sale? Because if the answer is no, a sale, no matter how painful, might be exactly what's needed to finally get out of that life situation. So sadly, it does not imply that you should never sell.
It's also the question of liquidity, and it's especially in Norway now. There's a huge discussion. We have a tax on wealth, so you're taxed on your perceived, like kind of a mark-to-market taxation on your perceived wealth, but a lot of things are defined as wealth, and a lot of people misunderstand that. They think that your net worth is liquid assets.
Right.
There is this kind of like, you have hundreds of millions in assets and you have almost no money. That's also kind of a complicated situation to be in, especially in your maybe your first company. I mean, if you've had 4 and you sold plenty, I'm sure
That's not really much. That's not really much of a problem because the financial world is ready to help. So what happens in that situation is, whatever it is you want to do, there's usually some way to do it. There's some financial penalty, but not much. So, for example, the most obvious thing is simply to take out a loan. So, if you know you have hundreds of millions of assets that are illiquid, you can still take out a loan for 10 million, 50 million, et cetera, something far below that. So it's so that even if those assets go way, way down, you're still covered. And sure, interest rates are high right now, relatively speaking. But on the other hand, once again, if you have hundreds of millions in assets, then even if you're paying, let's say 5, 6%, 7% even, I mean, that's starting to become kind of a lot. But if that's what's happening, and you need the cash for something, you can do that. If it's something like real estate, you can have reverse mortgages potentially. You probably have some sorts of assets that are also creating income. So, for example, of the money you do take out, you could put that into income generating financial instruments. Since you don't need, since you already have your sort of large asset based investments, you can just you can put it into more revenue generating instruments, and that generates money that's liquid. And then usually there's some opportunity to sell somehow, not always, but when you're talking about the amounts you're talking about, like if your company's worth 10 million, then it's not true that people will just want to buy this stock. But when it's hundreds of millions or billions, usually there's some sort of way to do secondaries or other ways to cash out some of that. So in practice, the financial world is ready to make you liquid for a price that you're probably willing to pay because of your total net worth. Now, to your point, if you want to tax your total net worth and you don't have the cash for that, that's different, because then you just straight up need the cash for that. So yeah, even in America, people suggest that, and I think there are ways of doing that. But you clearly, if it's illiquid and you're taxing it anyway, I think the flip side of I think that has to come with an ability to pay the tax using the illiquid assets. Like I don't think it makes sense to say, I'm taxing your illiquid assets, but you have to figure out how to become liquid to pay it every year. That feels like it's a little onerous in a way that's not useful. So if you could pay the tax with those illiquid assets, for example, then perhaps then we're back to a system where you can do that tax, but in a way where people can pay it.
Yeah. This is also the reason why there is a flood of people leaving this country because of the onerous tax. It's interesting because you also have a kind of an emotional, you approach this, appearing to approach this from an emotional point of view, which I also do instinctively. Is that correct?
Well, as opposed to what?
Clinical, I mean, analytical, like very matter-of-factly. You get this feeling that people are sort of, like I'm rewatching the TV show Silicon Valley. I don't know if you saw it.
No.
It's a very good description of running a startup, and people often appear to be these like the outward appearance is very mechanical, very analytical, but in reality it's a lot of managing your emotions. Wouldn't you say so?
I think even just to say a person who is unemotional about it must be managing their emotions. Even Vulcans have to manage their emotions. They exist. They have to manage them, right? So yeah, I don't believe it. I kind of don't believe in that. I'm very analytical in terms of how I think, and even in the writing that I've done over the last 16 years. A lot of it is analytical, right? But then a lot of it's emotional too. There's both, and I think that's just reality, is that it's both. Period. And so they're both interesting aspects to me of what it all is. Yeah, I totally agree with you. When it seems analytical, they must be suppressing. And is that good? I would think there's times where suppressing emotion is good. There are times when difficult decisions need to be made and then executed, and suppressing emotions through there might be useful to do. But I think in general, it's good to pay attention to emotions. Well, I'll say another thing is sometimes the emotions are wrong in the sense that emotions like envy or greed or guilt or these kinds of things, it's hard to say. Sometimes there's a useful component to it. Like a useful component to envy might be that you're competitive, and that might be good, but that you really just want to be like someone, or you think you're not as good because of some reason, like that's a bad thing. So I think all these emotions, probably there's negative forces they could create that you'd want to mitigate, but there's positive things they could motivate in you that's probably good. So I think that's maybe a lens to say, when I'm experiencing an emotion, that's information. So you can even be analytical about that. What is that telling me? Why am I feeling that, right? And is there a useful part to that I want to grab onto and use? Is there a not useful part that I need to try to let go of? And of course, that's super easy to say and very hard to do. So, yeah, thanks. That's actually pretty hard to do. Nevertheless, it's probably still the right attitude.
Easy to say, hard to do is probably a pretty good summary of being of running your own company.
Yeah, like it's probably the right idea, even if it's very hard to do.
A company typically have different phases, and you've been through, like, for instance, with VP Engine, it's become kind of a mature company.
Yeah.
Is there anything in the different phases, like maybe the startup period and the intermediate period and the mature, that would surprise people? Like things you've experienced that is not immediately obvious from the outside? It's a difficult question. I know. I'm sorry.
Yeah. There's a lot written about this, so maybe there's nothing too surprising. I guess what I would say is, I do feel like it's the kind of thing where if you haven't seen it before, then even if you've read about it, it's still harder than it seems. In other words, you can read The Hard Thing About Hard Things, for example. It's a great book that kind of describes the scaling phase and how that feels. And yet still, when you get there, it feels pretty bad, and you don't feel like you're prepared just because you read that book. So maybe in that way, it's sort of like having kids or making a startup in the first place, where you can read about it, but it's different when or at least it's the experience of doing it still feels different. So for example, you hear things like people problems become not just linearly more difficult, but non-linearly more difficult with scale. And actually the same thing with things like servers and technology. Same thing. It just becomes different in kind. It's not just more and harder; it's different and harder. And the difference is much harder to deal with because what's happening is rare things are becoming common. And the rare things are difficult to predict. They're maybe difficult to measure, especially, maybe difficult to measure, maybe difficult to mitigate or prevent, exactly because they're rare and weird and unpredictable. And so, but at scale, rare things are common. And so, what the hell do you do? And it is really hard, and in some cases, not even possible or not plausible to do something other than deal with it. So again, I can say that, so now you know, or maybe you already knew, and yet being in the middle of it, really, you're really like, God dang, yeah, okay, that's.
Can you give an example of something that's harder at scale?
Sure. So I can give you one, since we talked about analytical and emotional, I can give you one more analytical example and one emotional one. Does that make sense?
Sure.
So analytical one, imagine that you have a laptop and every once in a while it just crashes, like totally crashes, and you have to reboot. And let's say it's really rare, like once every 4 years. It probably has it probably needs a reboot more often than that. But let's just say it's a really high quality laptop. So only every once every 4 years or so it crashes. Let's say every 1,000 days or something. I guess it's more like 3 years. Okay, that seems like a pretty reliable laptop, actually. Nothing wrong with that. Now let's say you have 10,000 of them. Well, if each one fails, let's say once every 1,000 days, but at random, and you have 10,000 of them, that means 10 of them are failing every day. So of your pack of 10,000 laptops, you have 10 failures a day, which sounds like a lot. And they're completely unpredictable. and let's say unpreventable, because this was already super high quality. So now you have 10 like critical failures per day of hardware that you can't predict or prevent. So that's exactly what happens when you have a bunch of servers. That's precisely what happens. Some will fail. It's hard to predict or prevent. And if you have 10,000 of them, then it's happening constantly. So that means you have to architect everything around the fact that your infrastructure can fail. But when you're small and you only have 1 or 10 servers, you do not need to architect around that, because it almost never happens. So the very architecture of your whole application has to change dramatically at scale, because something that was rare became common. So that's an example that, like at WP Engine, that is our reality. In fact, we have more than 10,000 servers, so it's very much a reality. On the human level, same concept, but it takes a different form. So I once heard it described this way. So I didn't invent this analogy, but it's very right. So at about 1,200 people, WP Engine is like a small town in terms of the number of humans that are in it. And the funny thing about a small town is, there's enough people where all the things that happen to human beings are happening pretty regularly. There's always someone with a new child, someone with a death of a parent, someone getting married, someone getting divorced, an employee who commits suicide, but new employees too. There's all manner of things that happen with humans. And with 1,200 people, they're happening all the time. But it's small enough at 1,200, small enough that everyone kind of hears about it when this happens. So it's not like in New York City, that's happening constantly, but you don't know everyone in New York City because there's millions of people. But in the small town, you kind of hear about everything. Oh, did you hear this happened to this person, right? So there's enough people it's happening constantly, but small enough people that everyone hears about everything. And so there's this constant stream of news, and it's actually difficult emotionally. Even the good stuff, it's still a lot. It's a lot of humanity. You know what I mean? And so it's at this funny middle ground where you see it all, and you hear it all, and it's all happening. And that can be that actually is quite difficult on an emotional level. I don't know that we're fully equipped, or some of us anyway, are fully equipped for that. So that's kind of the same concept, right? Of this rare things becoming common, same concept, but at a human being level. And by the way, it doesn't help whether you're the CEO or not. You're going to hear about it anyway. So that's not really, well, I guess it is something of a question of management, because you're managing other people through that. But anyway, when there's only 3 people, that's not really happening. It's things that happen are rare, and you can kind of deal with it one by one. So I would say this idea that rare things become common, again, like maybe that's obvious to say, but hopefully those 2 examples help to draw out how it can appear in ways that take effort, mental effort, let's say, to cope with, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It reminds me of Foxconn, the producer of the iPhone. For years, it's been talked about the suicide nets outside their housings.
Oh yeah.
And in the company, the suicide rate is the same as the national average. But because of the visibility of it and this story getting out, but exactly what you explained, like with scale, you get just normal variation, but it looks like people are killing themselves because it's so horrible to work there. But it is reality of life. It's a very interesting point.
Right.
And also something you never think about. You think about you're going to be this patriarchal figure, and you're gonna be so rich, and you're gonna have so many people that look up to you and help you fulfill your dream or whatever. You never think about the sort of mundane reality of managing so many people.
Right. And it's not like you're going to read a book and have a technique where that doesn't happen. What, people don't get cancer and people don't get married? Really? You're going to solve that? Like, nope. If you have a lot of people, this is what happens, and there's no management theory or something that that makes that not happen. So yeah, it's simply a reality.
What about the different phases? many people, maybe myself included, think about like the early phases maybe as the best one, when it's just maybe the mix between an ID and a prototype, or an ID and the first customer, something like that, where it's like all the possibility but none of the responsibility. That's maybe the best part of the whole cycle. Is that true, or is there other parts that are maybe your 10th employee or something like that are equally sort of nice moments?
Well, I think it just, I hate saying it depends. It's just such a bad answer. So every time I've said it in this conversation, I've always followed it up with lots of detail, right? I think when you say what's the best moment, you can't help but say that that's very personal. So, for example, I know founders who would have told you that those early days were the best, but then as the company grew and they grew as a person, they grew to love the idea that they were over 100 people or 1,000 people. They loved that their role shifted. They enjoyed that, and their past self would have never thought that they would have enjoyed it. But it was part of their own personal growth, was that they grew in that way, and then now they love it. So those people would have said that those early days were the best, but having gone through more of the journey, they now will have said that all the stages were interesting and fun in their own way, just different, and that they love what they're doing now. Same person, okay? So that just shows you how it really is relative. But of course, it's true that it's pre. Those first, let's say, 10 or 100 customers is a different type of thing in terms of the challenges you have, and the stresses you have, and the work that needs to be done, what's unknown versus known, and so on. It's very different in that time versus, let's say, 100 to 1,000 customers versus up to around 10 people, which is where you generally need somebody in management. Before there's no one in management, then there is, and that's just a fundamentally different moment, because it's a new kind of person that was never there before, and communication gets harder because not everyone knows everything anymore, because it's not practical to be like that. So that's a moment where things change. Then there's a moment, I think around maybe 50 or 80, 100, something around there, where there's a second layer of management and things simply feel different. Also, there's a certain amount of money that must be going on if you have that many people. So there's more customers, and you start hitting early evidence of the scale stuff we talked about. And then I don't know that there's hard limits above that, but certainly like where we are now at around 1,000 people absolutely is different in kind than having 100. So is there one or two levels in between there, and where is it exactly? I'm not entirely sure. I know people love to talk about the Dunbar number of 150. To me, over 100 already felt like that, but maybe I'm just not as good at tracking 150 people. But 100 already started feeling like that to me. But certainly by 1,000, you can't all fit in one floor, and maybe not even in one building. You're probably not in one building. I know now everyone's virtual, but even if it's virtual, okay, fine. It's just the number of people you've never seen before at all. You don't even know that they worked here, much less know anything about them. Most of the people in the company are like that at that point, which is kind of a strange feeling, and also has implications again about communication and culture and stuff like that. You might have more than one product, which is different. So, again, exactly where the lines are drawn, I don't know, but it's certainly different. So isn't it logical that for different people, they will enjoy different phases? Of course, different personalities. And that's true of founders, but it's also true of employees. I know a lot of people who love being employee number 2, and they don't want to be there when there's 200 people at the company as an employee. You also know tons of people that are the opposite. They're like, I don't want to join a company that doesn't have everything figured out. I love to join a company during its scaling phase, because if they're scaling, let's say they have 100 people and they're growing fast, some people love that phase because they're like, okay, all the basics have been figured out. Do people want the product? Yes. What does the product do? We know. What's its position in the market? It's set already. There's a brand. Like, all the basics are done when you have 100 people and growing fast. You must have solved all the basics, but everything is now breaking in the company. Everything, because scale breaks everything. But because of this growth and everything, you probably have the ability to invest in things, whether that's brand that you couldn't invest in before, or engineering. And so there's so many interesting problems to solve that small companies never have. And now that all these basics are under your belt, you can solve these complexity issues of scaling. How cool! So there's people that absolutely love that, and they love joining a company at early scale. And once they sort of exit high scale and become more mature and stable, they're like, this isn't fun anymore. I want to go back to where it's fun, which is where we're scaling. And so those are people that love scaling. So the fact is, different people like different segments, and a person can change or like more than one segment. They can change over time, of course. And that's just the way it goes, because they're very different. They feel different. They have different challenges. They require different action. So it's just logical that people would enjoy some of those challenges and actions and not others, and that you may not know until you're in it whether you like it. I think that's pretty reasonable too.
You have over 1,000 employees. I know you're not the CEO, but I mean, it's your company. What do you do all day?
Well, I have a bit of a special role, as you pointed out. What I do is I take on projects for between 3 months and maybe 2 years, and in a sense kind of go where needed with a couple of projects. But that's a weird role because I'm the founder, and so that gives me a little bit of ability to do strange things. So at the moment, I'm helping our data teams, our internal data teams, which data is a specialty of mine anyway. And so it's a good way to lean into my strengths, something the company needs. And I like data. So there you go. See, here I am in the middle of my 3 circles. So I'm helping our data team as that continues, the team continues to grow in terms of humans. And we are adding projects that are exciting. And I'm also working on strategy. We just did a lot of strategy work in the last 6 to 9 months, and so I spent a lot of time on that. And then before that, for 2 years, I was working on a new product line that we launched in 2021 called Atlas. I don't need to go promote it or anything. I'm just saying we launched a brand new product line, and so I was running that for a while, and then a product leader stepped into that, and so I've been stepping further and further away from that. And the team is just running with that, but I helped to get that going and launching it, that product line. So I know it's this kind of a smattering of stuff, but again, that same framework, again, I use it constantly of that, love, skill, and need, that helps me understand if I'm in the right place or not at any given time.
That's actually quite a beautiful little theory you have. I truly like it. Very easy to understand, and I think you're spot on with your analysis.
Thank you. I did write it up for anyone that wants to reference it. I don't need to promote stuff, but I write online. I don't charge for it or anything like that. Just, it's just there. And so if you search for, I guess, Jason Cohen, my name, and fulfillment, you'll find it, and it includes that with those traps and things and other stuff too. Like, obviously I'm not the first person to think about what is fulfilling, and so I list, or I describe some other things in other people, other cultures, and how they think about it in there as well. So I feel like maybe in total it's a lot of good context, and so I hope that a person who goes there, among that whole forest of ideas, hopefully finds a few ideas that fit them well and that they want to take away from that, including mine, but including other good ideas.
Are you thinking about things like an IPO, for instance?
Well, the funny thing about that is no one ever talks about it, whether they're doing it or not.
Like everyone's always for sale, but nobody's actually never for sale.
Right. For the right price, right? And so, but you're not for sale, right? That's exactly right. I will say, this, and this is also advice I give other people. I've lived this not only at WP Engine, but at SmartBear before it. So I think this is useful, and it's a sort of answer to your question, which is the best thing you can do is keep options open for your future. So in other words, you could sell your company someday. You could IPO someday. You could get investment someday, whether you've already gotten investment or not. And that investment could take different forms. Like, it could be a loan, or it could be a revenue-based thing, or it could be a VC-based thing, or it could be an angel-based thing. Like, there's many kinds of investment anyway. You could not. You could just be profitable forever and do profit sharing. You could have a family-owned business where it's your family or people who are like family that take it over, and you have some sort of stipend or something. Like there's a million possibilities for where the company could go. It could also go out of business, right? Like these are all possible futures. To me, the right attitude as the founder or as the CEO really is to make a business where the most number of options remain open to you. And that because if you only build for one thing, like the only way we can succeed is going public, okay, well, you probably won't. And so then what? What happens next, since that's what you were planning on? Or sometimes I've occasionally seen people say things like, I'm building this company and our plan is to sell it to Amazon because it would be a good cloud service or something. Well, that's probably not going to happen. Even if it's a great company, it'll probably not happen. So then what? Then what are you going to do? Because you've optimized the company for something that didn't happen. So that doesn't sound right. So I don't like those kinds of ideas where you're planning for only one option. So what does it mean to keep your options open? Oh, and also what that means is, okay, even if you were to sell the company, you want to sell it on good terms, like at a high valuation, and maybe you want more cash instead of stock, and maybe you get more of the money now and not later. And like even within one option, there's a lot of variation of how good that option can be. So the way you do that is you just make a good company. And by good company, I mean a company that's growing at a healthy rate, that's profitable and getting more profitable, where employees want to be there, as evidenced by they stay for a long time. And great talent wants to be there and wants to stay. That's evidenced by your numbers there. Customers also want to come and stay, as evidenced by retention rates. Maybe even continue to pay more over time because they're acknowledging you're delivering more value somehow, and they're willing to pay for it. So in other words, all the usual things about what a good company means, those are among the things I mean when I say that. When you build just a genuinely healthy, good company, then that does keep all the options open. For someone to buy you, they would have to really give you a great offer, since there's no problems right now, and if you wanted to go public someday, well, these are the metrics people look at because that's what a good company is, right? So, okay, fine. Then you still want to build a good company, again, as defined by those things I just listed. So I feel like that should be the goal, to build a good company and measure it in ways like that. And that maximizes your optionality for what to do. So that's still how we run WP Engine today. And so that's why it is something of an answer to your question about IPO. Our answer is, we want to make sure we have this valuable, great company that we could run forever financially. And that keeps all the options open, including things like IPO and other options. It keeps it open because it's a good company. So I'm not just saying that to avoid the question. That's how I talk about it internally at WP Engine. It's how I've always talked about it. And also back in Smart Bear days, that's also how I talked about it. So that's not a non-answer or deflection. That's really how we think about it.
Finally, time is flying. I'm just sitting here enjoying listening to you, and we're almost at an hour. So I don't want to waste too much of your time on this. So finally, do you have any advice for people who are listening who either have just started a company, want to start a company? Is there any advice you can give that actually matter, or do you have to sort of live it and experience it?
Yeah. I think advice without context and without knowing the person and their goals, probably not good advice, but that's already good advice. In other words, when an article online tells you, you've got to do this, you got to take a step back and go, well, who are they writing that for? Are they writing it for a person like me with the goals I have, the place I'm at, and so on? If so, then maybe that's good advice. But if not, then you can ignore it. So already, I guess it's good advice to pay attention to what the advice is aimed at. I would say, in many ways, anytime you see advice that says do X, you can find examples of companies that did just the opposite of X and were very successful. And so it kind of calls it all into question. Like, again, any X, you can find people that did X and were successful, that did X and were not successful, that did the opposite of X and were successful and not successful, like all the things you generally can find examples of. So that calls into question, like, well, how valuable is this advice about X when all four of those quadrants have examples, right? Like, how important is that? How good is that? So on the one hand, that's frustrating because how do you know what advice to take? On the other hand, it's a little bit liberating in that, okay, there's no one critical thing I've got to read about and know, because I can find examples of the opposite. So that's not the case. So you can relax a little bit about that. So what do you do exactly? So this is what I think. I think the choices you make, should I do X or should I do Y? What advice should I take? They need to be internally consistent, self-consistent. So for example, if you say, I want a lifestyle business, and we were saying this earlier, so I don't need to repeat the point completely, right? If you say I want a lifestyle business, there are decisions that are consistent with that idea and decisions that are inconsistent. I think that makes sense. So I think when you start you want to put some stakes in the ground about what your goals are, what kind of company you want, what you want out of life. When you start putting those stakes in the ground, those are firm decisions. Once you've made some of those firm decisions, then you can start asking, what advice is consistent with that? Who are the people who have done that particular path? That's who I want to listen to. You still have to filter the advice, of course, and make it your own, but you can at least filter out some of the noise by yourself making some hard decisions, firm decisions, I should say, and then trying to limit the advice that you're getting to those that are consistent with that. I think there's some things that you can't escape, like there has to be enough people who want the product in the first place. Even if it's a lifestyle small business, there still has to be enough people because you're going to have to advertise or otherwise get to them. And not everyone will see every ad. In fact, most will never see your stuff. And the people that hit the homepage, you're lucky if 1% converts from there. And from there, you're lucky if they, more than a small number are still around in 3 years. So you have to start with enough people who have the problem that you're solving, even if it's a very small business, for that funnel to make any sense. Those people have to believe they have the problem. So in other words, you may know this is a problem in the world, but if the other person does not agree, if they don't know that, then they won't be searching Google and they won't be looking to spend money to solve it. So they have to believe it too. So there has to be enough people who believe in the problem, who also have a budget for the problem. They may have it, but they don't want to spend money. This is the classic problem with consumer applications, is that people are like, that sounds good. And you say it's $10 a month. They say, that's crazy. I pay only $7 for Netflix. No way. Even though it would deliver a lot of value, that's not necessarily how people rationally think about things. This is, by the way, a piece of advice I give is that you should probably sell to businesses and not consumers. And it's very obvious that that's biased advice. Clearly, you could sell to consumers and be successful. Obviously, you can. I just think it's harder. Maybe I'm just biased on myself. It's harder for me, so I'm just projecting onto everyone else. Probably. It's probably biased like that. I'm sure it is. But the fact is that businesses who have problems generally have a budget to solve it, and consumers not necessarily. So it just makes it harder. Of course, there are more consumers in the first place, so maybe that balances it out. Anyway, they have to have the problem. They have to know they have the problem. They have to have the budget and the will to solve the problem. They have to want to buy from you and not a competitor. They have to believe that you can do it, even though you're a young company with no assets and no other, no brand awareness and no other customers to reference, and not enough features. They still want to buy from you. Why is that? Why is that kernel of a product, that an original product, good enough that people still want to buy it? All these things have to be true for the business to work. It's not enough to have an idea. It's not enough to solve a problem. You have to have everything I just said and more. Like, that's not even all the things, but that's among the things. So at least those are some things that I don't know how you could have a company without them. Like, if there's no budget for your thing, it's not clear how you'll ever be successful. So once again, can you find counterexamples? You might. You might. Fair enough. But it's going to be really hard, really high risk, low chance of success. So maybe, but that doesn't sound so good to me. So I think, going back to the top, make some decisions about the type of company you want to build, why you're doing it, etc., because that will help narrow down what advice is useful to take. And then there's some of these fundamental elements, like the ones I just listed, that I think are either mandatory, or if not mandatory, then if you don't have them or you don't solve for them, you've added this enormous risk, or that's much, much harder to succeed. So either that means it's a bad idea, you should find a different idea, or maybe if there's overwhelming force in some other area that makes that okay, then that's okay again. But you better find that overwhelming reason why it's okay. So I think that kind of attitude allows you to stay in your own context and not just taking random advice off the internet. Because a lot of this is, I guess, asking questions of yourself and making sure that the components of success are there, not just the idea that you have. But ultimately, you have to apply my own advice to me and say, yeah, but, or maybe I go my own way. And I would admit, yep, I get it. Like, that's part of the point of being an entrepreneur, is you go your own way. So I get it. This is what I think makes things easier, less risky. I think ideas are better when they hit on all those points. I think that makes them more likely to succeed, but it's just my opinion. And so, sure. but to me, that is something that de-risks the company. I can't show you lots of data that proves it or anything like that. It's just my experience. So of course you should take it or leave it. But I would say at least think about it. Maybe in thinking through those things and asking those questions, even if you decide to ignore it, perhaps thinking through it is already helpful in any case. I often think that when I write a piece, I often think, even if you completely disagree with me, 180% or 180 degrees completely disagree with me, I've still helped you, because I've helped you figure out that you believe something completely different. But now you know what you believe more crisply than maybe you did before. That's awesome. So I feel like these things, whether it's this advice I just gave or anything that I've written, if you agree with it and want to take it as advice, great. I've been helpful. If you say, heck no, I've still been helpful because I helped you figure out whatever it is you want to do. And so that makes me happy, no matter what whatever you decide to do. It makes me happy if I've helped you be more certain in what you want to do. That's pretty cool. Then I feel like I've done something nice.
It's very inspirational to listen to, and I think a lot of people are helped by what you're saying, because there's a lot of literature on this, but I feel like there's a huge place for exactly your point of view here.
Great.
And almost philosophical in a way. Very inspirational. Thank you so much.
Thank you.